Hi everyone. I hope everyone's doing well and you're all learning exciting new stuff during your nano degree. I just want to make a quick reminder that the deadline for the second project is fast approaching, and as you know, it's a bit more difficult and it will take a lot more time to do. So I suggest you start planning your approach and the way you're gonna build it and get to work as soon as possible to ensure that you will have enough time to do it. Um, with that out of the way, with that out of the way, let me welcome you to the fourth content webinar. What we're going to discuss today is tightly connected to what we talked about last week. Last week, as you know, we talked about the DOM. Um, we the document object model, why it's useful and how we can access it, all that kind of stuff, the basics. This week, we're going to take a deeper dive into how we can interact with the DOM, change it, modify it, and restructure the HTML elements on the page. We will have a demonstration to see what type of things we can do to the DOM with JavaScript. I have prepared a few coding examples we're going to take a look at on CodePen and maybe get a better view and better understanding of how we can how we interact with the DOM. I've made a presentation again, which I'll send after the webinar ends, just so you can see what we're trying to explain and get a better view of it. So let's flip over to the presentation. Second. Um, Sorry for this. And yeah, there it is. So here's our topic. Creating, removing, and modifying DOM content. Here is the agenda for today and the topics we'll be exploring. First off, we'll start with a brief overview of the DOM. This is essentially what we spoke about last week, and we'll just gloss over that to just sort of familiarize ourselves about what the DOM is. Next up, we'll take a look at the tree structure of the DOM again and mention the most important things to remember about that. Remember, the DOM has a tree-like structure, just so you forgot that. And after that, after we've had a brief overview of those things, we'll see what kind of methods the DOM offers us when we're trying to select HTML elements on the page. Remember that before interacting with HTML elements, you have to select them first, so it's essential to know how. After we've seen those methods, we'll take a look at DOM methods that allow us to interact and change the DOM in some way. Here, we'll see how we can create new elements, move existing ones, delete elements, and others as well. Once we've seen how to do that, we'll take a look at some properties the document object has that are useful for us too. You probably remember for last week that all HTML elements are represented as objects, which are then properties of the DOM, actually of the document object. This is why we'll take a look at what each and every HTML element object is and what properties and methods it has as well. Something that we also discussed last week was that the DOM is not part of JavaScript, but we can use any scripting language to interact with it. And remember that JavaScript is a scripting language. In this nano degree and in web development in general, we'll use JavaScript. So we will have a look at how, with the help of JavaScript, we can interact with the DOM. Finally, there are some resources that I listed at the end of the presentation which you might find useful for furthering your understanding on these topics. And of course, we'll flip over to CodePen for some coding examples to see all this in action. Okay, let's begin. If you remember, last week we looked at a number of definitions for the DOM, and in the end, this here definition is what we decided that is easiest to understand and memorize for the document object model. Let's go through it one more time so we freshen our memory about it. So it goes like this. The DOM is an object-oriented representation. Essentially, this means that it's an object of the web page. Here, the web page symbolizes all the HTML we've written to construct it, which can be modified with a scripting language such as JavaScript. This tells us that the DOM is not part of JavaScript, and it can be modified by all scripting languages, which, of course, includes JavaScript. All right, now that we have some kind of understanding that the DOM is in fact an object and can be modified by JavaScript and calls all the HTML as properties, let's see a bit more in-depth explanation. Right, here again we can see that the DOM is an object. But now we see that it's programming interface for HTML and that it defines the HTML as objects. And it also stores that the methods and events, like it says here. So essentially, what a programming interface is a place where we use a programming language. Remember that JavaScript is a programming language to access these objects and their properties, methods, and events. We've not yet covered events for HTML elements. That's something we're going to do next week because it's heavily concerned in your project. So it's very important to look at those two, and we'll do that next week. Let's go to the other slide. Here it is. And finally, in the simplest terms, the HTML DOM is a standard for getting, changing, adding, or deleting HTML elements. Okay, I think that it cannot get any simpler than this, and I'm sure you now have a solid understanding of what the DOM is. And with that, let's see again one of the most important things to memorize for the DOM, and namely that it has a tree-like structure, as you can see here. It all begins with the document object on the top right here. I have added a little note on the bottom right here that which says that we use the document object to access the DOM in the browser. After that comes what we call the root element of the DOM. So the root of the HTML tree, here it is, the HTML element. And then the HTML tree branches out into two separate ways. One is the head element, the head tag, which contains the metadata about our website or our app, and the body tag, which holds all the visible HTML content on the page, and its attributes, its events, and its properties, like we saw in the previous slide. The body tag then branches out and branches out more and more as the HTML structure of our website grows more complex. So here we just have a simple anchor tag, a link, and an H1 which is essentially a big header that contains a bit of text. So it's pretty simple, but imagine that you have a big production ready website, which is going to be a lot more complex than this. So the structure here after the body tag can get quite overwhelming as the website grows bigger and bigger. And that's essentially how the HTML tree is created. Sorry. Now, let's get into the interesting stuff. Let's see what methods we can use to select HTML elements on the page. Remember that we define HTML elements in our HTML file. And only then, after the DOM construction process, something that we talked about last week, happens and is complete, only then we can use JavaScript to access the document object and the relevant methods we want to use to get the needed HTML elements. You should remember that anytime we want to do anything to the DOM, we must first select the appropriate elements, and only then we can do something to them. So it's essential to know how to use the methods for selection the DOM has given us. Let's just have a quick word about what DOM methods are in general before we get into the actual methods. The methods are just actions. Actions, as you know, in JavaScript are represented by functions you can perform on HTML elements. So methods are functions we can use to do something to HTML elements. In this case, select them. The methods of the DOM are accessed on the document object. And remember that to access a property or a method of an object, in general in JavaScript, we have two different methods. Generally, the one we use the most of the one we use most of the time is the dot notation, and that's signified by this little dot here. We have an example here, a method. This is a method on the document object, and here is the dot. So to access a method or property on an object, we first reference the variable the object is stored in and place a dot after it only, and only then we can access its contents. Here you can see an example of how to access the get elements by tag name method, which selects all paragraph elements on the page. Firstly, we reference the document, here the document variable, which holds the DOM, and then place a dot here in the end. And after we've done that, we are free to select anything we want from the document object. In this case, the get elements by tag name method. And that's how we're going to get all methods and properties of the document object. Remember that the document variable that stores the HTML tree is supplied to us by the browser once the DOM construction process is created. And here are most of the methods we will be using to select HTML elements. There are some others, but I thought that it's unnecessary to explain them since we're not going to be using them all that much. Of course, I've put a link in the resources in the end of the presentation where they're all listed and have explanations attached to them. So if you wanted to have a look at them, you can do so. Okay, so we can split these 5 methods into 2 groups. The criteria is the way we select the elements. The ones that allow us to select elements the way we do in CSS are the first 2. And the others, they simply don't allow us to select elements the way we do that in CSS. The ones that do allow us are here, query selector and query selector all. I will mention that these two are the only methods used for selection of HTML by most professionals on real-world projects, only because they don't have to think about what the method name was for selecting classes, tags, IDs, namely these three. So you don't need to consider whether the element has an ID, a class, or just a tag. You just specify the query selector and select it like you would in CSS. So if you have a solid background in CSS, it's more than likely you're going to be using the query selector. The developers just know how to select them in CSS, and it's more convenient for them. I want to mention, however, that this is just the way most people do it, and in programming, there is almost never one way to do things. There are a million ways, and it depends on your own personal way of doing things. So if you feel that you prefer the other methods, don't sweat it and just use them instead. Do whatever is best for you, what you understand, and know how to do best. The other methods for selections are ones we discussed briefly last week. So the get element by ID, the get elements by class name, the get elements by tag name. We all discussed them briefly last week. The get element by ID method, this one, is used for selection of elements that have an ID attribute specified on them. Remember that the ID attribute should be unique and that it should be used sparely. So we shouldn't be putting IDs everywhere on the page just because this makes it really confusing for others, having all these IDs floating around. So a few use cases you might consider to use ID as an attribute is when you have an ordered list, for example, and you want element to have a special style or to behave a different way in relation to the others, or some kind of grid system or many images, repetitive content, which is more than two or three, which has more 2, 3 items, and then you might want to use an ID attribute just to make it stand out and easy for selection. With this method, the get element by ID, we get a reference to the HTML with the specified ID and do whatever we want with it. So this method, the get element by ID, returns the element itself. That's important to remember. The get elements by class name method selects all elements with the specified class. What we should always remember using this method is that it returns an HTML collection and not an array. So we should be careful because sometimes this can cause data type issues, which are not that easy to debug. You might have the situation, I've had it a million times, where you write the document get elements by class name selection method, and in it you correctly specify the class and you think, yeah, I've selected it. You store it in a variable, you write some kind of function that takes in this collection of elements on the page that have this class, and somehow the function does not work. And that's because what gets returned from document.getElements by class name is an HTML collection. We should always keep this in mind because it's not an array, it's not the elements themselves, it's an HTML collection, and that has different properties. It behaves differently to normal arrays. And that's something we should keep in mind always, always, always. And finally, the getElementsByTagName method gets elements based on their HTML tags. That's to signify whatever elements we may think of, you know, a UL element, an H1 element, a P element. Those are simply the tags. Here, we should also keep in mind that this method returns an HTML collection. So these two methods, we should be extremely careful with them. Something to note about HTML collections is that we have to use a special loop to loop over these elements and get the ones we want. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing I wanted to mention about the query selector all method is that it returns a node list. And from experience, I can tell you that the node list has a neat method on it, which we can access, called forEach, which really helps us loop over the content in the node list, all the HTML elements, and it helps for easy selection of the ones we want. And that's not so with the HTML collection data type. Here we have to manually write out our own loop, which is time consuming in my opinion, and that's points for the CSS selectors, as I like to call these two methods. And so that's for the DOM methods for HTML selection. Now let's have a look at what we can do to the HTML elements once we've selected them correctly. Remember that these are methods of the document objects. We access them just like we did the previous ones by first referencing the document object. Here, document, document, document. We must never forget the document. We can't just put remove child as a function, standalone function, without the document reference before it. So here are some of the methods for modifying the DOM. The first one is create element. As you probably guessed it, this creates an HTML element. Inside the parentheses, we must specify what element we want to create. Note that this method does not put an element on the page. Once we create the element, we must manually put it into a space that's convenient for us. So we can't just create an element and leave it like that and ask where is it, because it's not going to show up unless we specify where that should happen. The next method is remove child. This removes an HTML element and is what we'll be using to remove all HTML elements on the page. No matter if it's a parent, a sibling, or a child. Remove child is the function we're gonna always use. In the parentheses of this method, we specify which element exactly we want to remove. So we must have a reference to it stored in a variable beforehand. That's really important to remember. The appendChild method places an element at the end of its parent. This method is called on the parent, and inside the parentheses, we pass the element we want to create. There also exists insert before, insert after, which are similar in usage, but place the element in different places in the parent. You can have a look at those in the link in the resources slide we'll get to at the end. The replace child method replaces a child element with another one. Inside the parentheses, we specify first the element we want to insert in the DOM, and the next parameter is the element we want to remove. So we must have a reference to the new element and the old one. So we have to use the selection methods we saw earlier to get the reference for the new and the old HTML elements we want to remove or replace. All right, those are some of the DOM methods we can use to modify the HTML structure. Now remember, there are others, and you can take a look in the link at the end of the presentation in the resources slide. Now, let's see what properties the DOM has that can be useful to us. Of course, a property on an object is a key value pair that you can use to access or modify. All properties are mutable, so they can be changed and read all the time. HTML objects, like the document object too, have properties that we can modify, which we'll look at a bit later. And again, a reminder that to access a property, we have to reference the variable that holds the object and put a dot after it, just like we've done here, document.domain. So domain is the property that's located on the document object. I should mention that the document object has many properties, and here are just 4 of them. You can see the whole document object and its properties and methods by typing console.dir, and in the parentheses, you can type in document in the DevTools console in your browser. So let's actually do that now. Let's just open a new page, get the inspector going. Here's the console, and just type in console.dir. Remember, it's .dir, not .log. I'm sure you thought it was .log. And here in the parentheses, we have the document. And we hit enter, and we get this hashtag document returned to us. If we click on it, look at all these methods and properties. They are a lot. So we have a property for the cookies, for the content type, for the domain, as we saw. Here are all the events that we're going to take a look at next week. We have on click, on change, on can play, on cancel, on drop, on mouse move, essentially every single event we have here. We have the plugins, we have the scripts, all the scripts. So the Google homepage has 9 scripts. That's a lot. It has style sheets as well, WebKit visibility states, and that's it, all of them. It's a big object. Now let's get back to our presentation. Okay. Here, I've listed just 4 properties of those that I think might be used. Generally, we don't really use any of these properties in most applications, but sometimes you might see them and wonder what they do. So The head property returns the head element. As you remember, this is where we store metadata such as the title of the page, links to style sheets like CSS, fonts as well, and others. We can use the head element, actually when we get the reference to it, to dynamically remove or add metadata to our website. So we can include a new link to a existing file we have locally or on the web, you know, to do something interesting. I don't know. I've never really done that. Now, the body property returns the body tag of the document. Um, in it, there are all the HTML elements visible on the page. We can use it to append, prepend elements with the methods we saw earlier. So once we get a reference to the body elements, we can dynamically generate or remove, modify as well content inside it. The title property returns the title of the page. This is the text that appears next to the favicon of our site in the tabs bar. So right next to the favicon. We can use the title property of the document object to remove it, modify it. Not really useful, but just so you know, you can do that. The URL property returns the full URL of the HTML document we are viewing. Again, not much we can do with this as well. One thing we can do is to dynamically navigate to other web pages, although this approach is not really advised to be used. We should use link tags instead. So these are a very small number of the document objects properties. Again, you can see them all by typing console.dir, and in the parentheses, you can put the document object in the DevTools console, of course. Now let's see what an HTML object looks like. I hope you can see it clearly here. I have taken an element, an image with the ID of HP logo from the Google homepage again, and I've typed in console.dir, and this is what we get, and this is what we will have every single time we use console.dir on an HTML element. This is what we get when we use the selection methods of the DOM. We get an object which represents the HTML element on the page. This object has properties and methods which we use to interact and modify it. The object contains all the characteristics of the HTML element, and that's why it's a huge object with many properties, which include height, width as well. Yeah, here we have height. The width is a bit down. We have hidden, which is set to false, so we can set it to true, and it hides the element. Remember that to modify properties on an object, we reference the object first. So that's to reference the HTML object, we first use the selection method of the DOM and assign them the return what we get from the selection to a variable, and after we have the variable, we use a dot, as you can see here, to select any properties or methods. And that's what we're doing to modify HTML elements. We'll simply access their objects and modify their properties or use their methods. Here you can see an example of how we can hide an element from view. We just simply access the hidden property of the HTML object and set it to true. Once we do that, the object is hidden from view. So it's pretty easy. As you can see here, something I should mention is that the element is in blue because this here can be anything you name. It's not elements always. So here is this variable contains the selection method we used before to select the element we want. So that's something you should bear in mind. Here are some of the elements and properties we will see in action later on. I won't explain them in detail because they're pretty much all used in the coding examples we'll be doing in a bit on CodePen. So the important thing to remember here is that we're referencing a variable here by the name of elements. This variable holds all the properties and methods listed here and the ones we saw on the previous slide. We're not referencing the document variable here because we're not trying to access the DOM. These properties and methods are not on the DOM object. That's something we should remember. We already used the document to get the element object, and now we access and modify properties on it and not the document. Here, as you can see, we have the children property, which returns again a collection, an HTML collection of an element's child elements. So we can use this to get a HTML collection of all the elements, child elements. The inner HTML of property of the element object sets or returns the HTML content of an HTML element. The inner text property sets or returns the text content of an element. So this inner text property is not really useful to us when we're working with image tags and some kind of media that's not a paragraph or H1 or some kind of text HTML element. The class list property returns again an HTML collection which has the class names of an element. This is a property which you will be using a lot when you're modifying elements, so we should keep that in mind. The insert before method, this is a method this time, inserts a new child element before a specified existing child node. Here, node just means an element. Remember from last week that we said that nodes are containers for HTML elements. So to be able to use the insert before method, we must have a reference to the elements we want to insert and the one we want to be inserting before it. So keep that in mind that you're going to have to always select the elements before doing anything with them. The remove child method, I think we discussed that one. It just removes a child element from an element. The set attributes method is something you'll probably use again a lot. It sets or changes the specified attributes to the specified value. So beside the attribute name here, we will have to specify the value which we want the attribute to have as well. To interact with the DOM, as we already know, we use JavaScript, any programming language, but in our case, it's JavaScript. So let's see what we can do with it. And in general, we can change, create, and remove HTML elements, change, remove, or add their attributes, modify their CSS styles, and react to all existing HTML elements events on the page, which, by the way, are properties on the document object, as you saw earlier. So this is essentially gives us the power to do anything we want to HTML elements. We can modify the styles, the attributes, the elements themselves, and react to events. Everything. So that's why JavaScript is so powerful when interacting with the DOM. And here's the strategy we will always be using when interacting with the DOM. First and foremost, we will access the document object. We will always do that, no matter what. Next, we will choose the selection method that is appropriate for the selection we want to make. And here I have added a bit of myself, which by experience I think is a good approach. I think we should almost always store the selected elements in a variable for future reference. That way, we'll make our code a little bit more legible to others that might be viewing it, and to us when we come back a time later to make sense of it quickly. After we have our elements and the variables, the final step is to do whatever we want with them. These three simple steps are what the process of interaction with the DOM consists of. And finally, I've put together a list of some resources I think will be useful to you. We have the DOM reference by the World Wide Web Consortium. There are some good exercises here which you can practice the methods and the properties. So do check that out. The document objects, properties, and methods are listed here again, so you can look at them as well. The properties and methods of all HTML elements are in the MDN documentation here, so you might want to check this out and get an idea how and what you can modify on HTML elements. And finally, an article showing the techniques for selection of DOM elements. This is a bit of a practical approach from experienced developers. It's an opinion again, but you should definitely accumulate opinions of experienced people and see how this works for you and if it's your team. Do check these resources if you have time. And that's it for the presentation. I will send this to you just in case you find it useful. And now let's have a look at some actual code to clarify what we just talked about. So here is the project, the small project I have come up with just to demonstrate what we just talked about. It has a simple structure, a big container, a header with this text here, a small section that's really a circle with a number in it, and an ordered list, which is basically a table that contains 9 circles, or bubbles as I've called them here. I'm using special characters for these here just in case you're wondering, these are not images, these are scalable, fully scalable. By this is how you create them. There's a special reference on the MDN webpage again for special characters. Look that up if you want. And finally, I have a model, a div with a class of model that holds this content, which is currently hidden. So we will finally we will access that and show that up on the page when we want. So you might find a close resemblance between the second project, this. I wanted to get you in that frame of mind just so you get familiar with this, how we can interact with it, show it, show the elements, hide the elements, create elements, and all that. The CSS is nothing fancy really, just some spacing, border radius, and all that. We have two animations here defined with the keyframes at rule. Nothing too interesting or too crazy. We'll see them in action later. Some classes, and basically that's it. Here are the resets, just in case you're wondering what that is. Here is a font I've included to make it a bit more fancy. And that's it. So let's get started. I'll just minimize the CSS editors and the HTML editors because we'll be focusing on JavaScript. I have previously written all the things we're going to take a look at because I think that writing them out live takes a bit more time than it should, and it's just it's slowly and slow. It's slow and it hinders the process. So first off, we will select the body. Remember that the body is a property of the document object. Here it is. So we select the body property, which returns the body HTML element, and access its children property right here, which returns an HTML collection of all the elements in it. So everything you see here is a child of the body element. And it's stored in an HTML collection once we access the children property. So we access the first element of this HTML collection, and here we access the style object. The style is a property on every HTML object, and it is itself an object. So it's a property of the HTML element, and it's an object itself that has all the CSS properties as properties itself. So we access the background property of the style object of the first child element of the body. So that's that will produce this result here, and not storing the body in a variable because that's generally not done. We're starting off easy just so you can see immediately an effect on the page, and just notice the background. Here it loaded, and now it's a bit darker. Let me just turn it off. It's lighter, and now it's darker. Here we go. So that's what we did here. Let me just remove that so we can see what every piece of code does to the page. We use the query selector method here to select the elements that has a class of bubble yellow. Here, as you can see, we're selecting it just like we would in CSS. That's what query selector allows us to do. Once we selected, we store in the yellow bubble variable. And that's the first bit and the second bit of the process, of the three-step process. We select it and we store it in a variable here. The third step is to just do something with it. In this case, the bubble that has a class of bubble yellow, here we select it. As you can see, we again access its children property and select the first child. That's this span here. This is a span with the letter Z. And watch what happens with it when I uncomment this line. This line uses the remove child method, so it should remove the letter Z here. Let's see if that happens. And yes, there it is. Now it's gone. Remember that we have to have a reference to the element and the element we want to remove, the child element we want to remove. And that's what this method does. Now just uncomment these lines again. Let's actually hold this one for later. The next thing we're gonna see is the create elements method. Here we're using it to create a list item element. Then once we've created this element, it's invisible. Like I said, the create element method itself does not place an element on the page. We have to specify where it should be. We first do some modifications to the properties of the newly created elements to make it visible. Here, as you can see, we modify the inner text so it has Fend session 799 is awesome. As you can see, you're awesome, guys. I love it. So then we add a class by the class list dot add method, and we add a class of bubble, which has all these circles here all have the bubble class themselves. We set the font size by the style object. As you can see, the style object has all the CSS properties. First, we get the font size, then the text align, and modify them as well. So here, we create the elements. Here we modify the inner text, and we add a class of bubble. Then we modify the font size, we modify the text align, and notice how there is no element on the page. And that's because we've not specified where this element has to be. So to place it somewhere, we'll first select the table, the element with a class of table. This is here, this rectangular shape. Now we have it stored in the table variable. And we will use the append child method and pass it the new element that we created here, the list item that has all these properties. And so it should appear at the bottom of the table. Let's see if that's going to happen. And in fact, it does. Here it is, the new element. Fend session 799 is awesome. So that's what the create element does. However, we have to use another method to put it on the page. So let's remove that for now. That's how we create an element. What about removing elements from the page? We can use remove child for that, just like we did here with the Z. So now that we have the table element selected, we can select the bubble which has the letter A in it by using the children property again, selecting the first element in it, which will return this here bubble with A in it, and we store it in the A variable. And we will again use the remove child method and pass it A. to be removed. Remember, we're referencing the table. Let's uncomment that and see what happens. And there it is. It's removed. Okay. So let's comment these lines so they don't conflict anywhere in the code. To use the get elements by tag name, I devised another example that selects the section element we had here, this round shape here with 0 in it. It again returns an HTML collection, and that's why again we use the bracket notation you see here, 0, to access the first element, and in this case the only one in the collection. So no matter how many elements there are of the type we've specified, in this case section, it will always return a collection, never the element itself. So we must use bracket notation to select the ones we want. After we've selected it, so now we have the selection, and we're going to use the set attributes property, and we will select, we will put the class property and set it equal to navy. So what this will do is to apply the CSS class navy to this attribute, to this element, sorry. So we have this navy class defined in our CSS here, so it will be automatically applied to this section here. And you should see a difference, hopefully, once I uncomment this line. And here we go. The background has changed. It's a bit bluish now, a bit navy. Okay, so that's what set attribute does. It sets a class, the class attribute, and sets it equal to navy. Okay, we can set multiple classes in here. For example, bubble. Let's see what that happens. Nothing actually, because the bubble is a flex item here, so it won't work in this case. All right. In the next example, we simply select the header, this one, DOM interaction. That has neatly a class of header with the query selector method, and we will change its color, and after that its text. Here we have the selection, so now the color should change. Again, we're referencing the style object and the color property of it, and set it equal to this. Let's see what happens. There it is, it's now yellow. Now here the shadow before it is a text shadow. This is not the color, just so we know. And now let's modify the text actually. Let's set it equal to just DOM. And there it is. The text is modified. We can do something else like JavaScript, for example. There we go. That's that example covered. And here we'll do something a bit more complex. Firstly, we'll select the span element, which has an ID attribute set to number, with the get element by ID method. It returns the element itself and not an HTML collection like the ones we saw earlier. Then we will set its inner text property to what we have specified in the HTML document, incremented by 1. What that looks like is number inner text. So we set the inner text property, and here you can see it's 1 now. Remember, in the HTML we've defined that should be 0. Here we are referencing that by using again number inner text, which returns the 0, and actually that returns a string. So that's why we're using this here plus sign to convert this here string to a number, so we can increment it by 1. So if we just use here number.innerText, it would be 0, 1, because the string will be concatenated with the 1 here, as you can see. What the plus sign does is to convert this to a number data type, not a string. And that's what that does. Okay, so now it's back to 0. We define a function here, a getSeconds function. There it is. We define it now. Just ignore this show model, and we will use that later. Ignore this for now. This function gets the current seconds, so according to the timer. Using the date object here, we initialize a new date and use the getSeconds method on it. And this returns the seconds and assigns them to the date variable. And the number variable here should have its inner text set to the new date. And finally, we pass this function as a callback function here to the time variable, which defines a function called setInterval. So this is a global function which we can use always, which basically runs the function we pass it, so getSeconds, every time the time that we pass as the next argument expires. So here we have set 1000. This is milliseconds. So 1000 milliseconds is equal to 1 second. So we should see the time increasing. And there we go. It started at 23 because right now it's the 23rd second. As you can see, it's growing every single second. That's because the setInterval function is running every second. We can set it to, for example, every 3 seconds. So let's see what that happens. It's 47 now. It's 50. So it should be 53. Yeah, there we go. Every 3 seconds it changes. Let's set that back to 1 second and leave this here for now. So next up, we will select all the elements with a class of bubbles with the querySelectorAll method. Remember that this returns a node list that has a for each method. Remember that we talked about this a bit earlier. We use this method to loop over all the elements and say that if the text of the element we're looping over is W, then remove this element. So we want to remove this element here with this for each method. So first let's select them. Now we have a node list here in the bubbles variable, all these 9 bubbles here. And we use the for each and specify an if statement here. We access the inner text of each bubble we're looping over. Notice that this is an arrow function, an ES6 feature. And if the content is W, we access the parent node here, which is essentially the table, and use the remove child method by passing in the bubble we're currently looping over. So this here will be true for only this element. So only this should be removed, or else every single other element here should receive a color of pink. So because its inner text is not W. Let's see if that will work. And as you can see, the W is gone. and no other pink except for this one because we've defined that in the previous section. Okay, and that's what that does. After that, let's convert all these remaining bubbles to have a border radius of 0, which will turn them into squares. And there we go, they're now squares. Border radius property is used to define a circle, and if you set it to 50%, you'll get a clear circle. But if you set it to 0, you get this square looking element here. And finally, we have a bubble with a class of bubble yellow. So let's actually color that background with a yellow color, because that's what the developer before us has specified. So again, we're going to use the for each loop and loop over all the bubbles, and if the bubble has a class of bubble yellow, we check that with the class list here, a class list property, which is an object that has a contains method here, this one, the contains, and we pass in the class we want to select. We want to check if it has. So it's a list, and we check if the list contains the bubble yellow. And if it does, it should turn yellow. And here it is. This is the element that has the class of bubble yellow. So to use the getElement by ID method, we will select this here element, the one with the diamond in it. And then we'll just apply an animation, the one we defined earlier in the CSS, to it, so it should rotate now. First, let's select it, and now we have the selection. Let's access its animation property of the style object and set it to the animation we defined in the CSS. So here we go. Now it's rotating like crazy, as you can see. That's a cool way to add animations to your properties and to your elements. Sorry. Here we will check if, again, use the bubbles that we selected here with the query selector all. Again, we'll use a for each, but this time, besides the bubble we're currently looping over, we want to access the index of each of the elements. So on the for each loop, that's why I said it's so powerful and so handy, because we can access the index as well. And here we specify two if statements. We specify that if the index is 2, so if we're accessing the third element, as you know, in JavaScript, arrays and node lists and pretty much everything is 0 indexed. So the 0 here signifies the first element, and the 2 signifies the second. So we're gonna apply the the glow class here to the third element. So the D here, the element with the D, and we'll set a glow class to it with the class list.add method. And the glow class we've previously defined in CSS, it just has an animation that has a glow-like effect. And to the first element here, the A, we will remove the class bubble, which will make it look silly. And there it is. This here keeps on glowing because it's an infinite animation. And here the A is left just hanging because we removed the class. So let's return this back to how it is. It's a bit ugly. And finally, we're gonna make the model appear. First, we select it by the get elements by class name, and immediately here access the first element. Notice this. Immediately we access it, the model. Here we'll define a numbers array, you'll see in a bit why, and a function that has a name of show model. So here we specify an if-else statement and reference the numbers array. Here are just the strings from 1 to 10. We access the includes method of every array. So every array has the includes method. And the number here, this number variable, remember accesses this, which is now currently showing the seconds. So here we pass this, the text here, so 4, 5, 6, to this numbers array. So if this numbers array includes the seconds now, we will change the model's display property and set it to flex. That's gonna make the model appear here. And if the number here is not in the numbers array, it will not be displayed. So here we'll uncomment the line show model, which passes the function that runs every single second. Remember, define the set interval. So every time here we have seconds from 1 to 10, our model should appear, because remember, we've defined it here. So we should see the model appearing now. And there it is. Congratulations, you've reached the end of the webinar. Here, 7, 8, so it's still in the array, and it's not in the array anymore here. And so that's what I wanted to show you. Hopefully you found some use for it, and you can use some of this on your project as well. This is the end. This is the end of the webinar. I hope you got some useful tips. You understood some useful stuff that you can use on your project as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at any time. That's all from me. Have a good night, and I guess I'll see you over in Slack. Thank you for attending. So let's see that if we have any questions. So we don't. And okay, I think it's safe to end it here. Bye-bye.